Think of being given a pair of spectacles that allow you to see everything in X-ray vision. There have been a few sci-fi movies along this line, but this isn't fiction. The Bible has books and passages that contain what is called apocalyptic literature, and their basic function is to give us the eyes to see underneath and behind and below the physical reality of the world, to show us how it all spiritually works. Apocalyptic literally means unveiling. But for most Christians, apocalyptic literature of the type we find in the Bible's final book, the book of Revelation, is far from clear. Death riders, pale horses, beasts with horns, plagues and trumpets, weird numbers like 666 and 144,000. It's a language that very few seem to know how to decode, and not everyone who claims to have found the code can be trusted. But at least the persecuted can be trusted, because the apocalyptic passages were written primarily for them, for believers who were about to die. And as we approach this great book of Revelation, just listen to this dialogue overheard recently in China between a well-known house church pastor and a visiting preacher from the United States. It might help us to understand and apply the great visions in this perplexing and astonishing book. The American pastor said, "Well, what book of the Bible is most precious to you?" The Chinese pastor replied, "Well, probably the book of Revelation, because," and then the American pastor broke in and says, "because your suffering makes you long for the end of the world, and you're strengthened by the vision of love of how it will end with Christ's victory, right?" Chinese pastor smiled and he said, "Well, that too, but we don't just take Revelation to be a description of the way the world will end. We see it also as a description of the way the world is now." The American pastor looked a little puzzled. "I'm not understanding you. Surely Revelation is the book that tells us how the world will end." Chinese pastor said, "I'm telling you that it's also a description of the way the world is now. Suffering has made this clear to us in China. Clearly, prosperity has hidden this from you, where you come from. You see, we had a Caesar here in China called Mao Zedong, and he, like the Caesar of the early church period, demanded what was not only his, but God's. Like in Revelation, he used a beast to coerce us, communism, a false prophet to beguile us, false bishops, and when we resisted this idolatry with the testimony of the Lamb, we were slaughtered and jailed. So in this way, we saw that Revelation is a description of the spiritual war that always goes on in any society, including yours." The American pastor said, "But it's not going on in America today. You say we have that hidden from us. What do you mean?" So the Chinese pastor said, "Well, this conflict is obvious to us in China because you couldn't miss that Mao was setting himself up as an idol and demanding worship. So the veil was removed. We saw the world as it really is, a place where idols demand worship. But it's not obvious to those in the West because it takes a more subtle form." And then the American pastor said, "Perhaps it's not happening at all this way. I live in a Christian country." The Chinese pastor said, "But I tell you, there are beasts or idols in your society, just as much as in ours, and even in your churches. And there are false prophets telling you that this idolatry might even be biblical, and beasts are coercing you. Your beast may not be a person, but an idea." In our fellowship, we had a clever young man who lived with an American family for a while he was studying. The couple were very generous, but he noticed something about them. They were always exhausted. Both worked incredibly hard, though they had plenty of money. 3 cars, 2 homes, expensive club memberships, and as far as he could tell, gave only the minimum to the Lord's work. They never asked him a single question about the Chinese church. And when he left, they gave him an envelope with $20 in it. And he said, "I felt very sorry for them. They thought they were free, but they were slaves. They were dropping from exhaustion because they felt they had to pursue a lifestyle in order to feel good about themselves. But they never knew that the pursuit of that life had stolen their hearts away from Christ. Do you see what I mean? Persecution is a way of forcing us to bow down to God. But to those who do not have the light of persecution, they don't even see that they're bowing down. That's why we need to listen to the persecuted church. We can give you an insight that will enable you to see the world through apocalyptic eyes and become one of the persecuted yourselves, which is your destiny. Because Christians are people who are called to resist idols. The American pastor thought about this and he said, if what you say is true, then consumerism could be a more effective killer of the faith than communism. The Chinese pastor agreed. You're right. This is what we are afraid of here. Consumerism clutters up life so much that we fail to see the world as it is, full of idols trying to steal our worship from God. We can help you, but you must pray for us also. This is how a book like Revelation works. It's not only about how the world will end, it's how the world is underneath. So the book of Revelation is there to help us see the world with apocalyptic eyes that see beneath and behind the evil and the mayhem and the suffering and the sorrow, to see a little of the world from God's perspective. Yes, of course, it is a book describing how the world will end, but it's also a book that tells us how the world is now. Like it or not, we are trapped in a place where a great grand game is being played. It's called worship wars. There are forces in the world wanting to steal our worship away from God. Sometimes they are subtle, sometimes they are brazen. Behind it all are forces of evil who are insanely jealous that humans should trust and love God. And what we call history is their attempts to stop us worshiping. The good news, of course, is that we're not left defenseless in this onslaught. We have a part to play, all right, and our prayers are vital, and God is on our side, and history is still His story. Everything is working together, building to a beautiful climax, where we will be with God in a golden city with no temple, no night, no sorrow. But in the meantime, we will learn that winning doesn't always look like winning underneath. It's the Lamb that brings us victory. It teaches us how to believe when the beast appears to be winning. It helps us to see the Lamb on the throne. So this is not a book to fall out with other Christians over. This is the book to see how the Lamb is always winning underneath the chaos, the rubble, the crying, and the fear. It is less about how the world ends and more about how the Bible ends and how we use the story of the end to make a new beginning. A very wise preacher once said, there are two types of story in the world, alpha stories and omega stories. Alpha stories are the ones we usually tell, the stories of our beginnings, of our ancestors, places of birth, experiences we had growing up. They tell everyone who we are. But do we make as much of our omega stories, which are to do with where we are going? Not stories of origins, but our destination stories. Revelation is our omega story, and we are invited to live shaped by where we are going as by where we have come from. It has been said, once you have chosen your destination chooses you. In Revelation, we are invited to choose our destination. Jesus said in the book, I am the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. Can we take His invitation and expand our own identity? We are being pulled toward a world where we have full communion with God and neighbor, away from despair and evil, towards justice and peace for all people. We see the plot behind the universe. We see heaven awaiting us at the end of the universe. decisions. We trust the God who was on the throne and is bringing it all about. And once we see that throne, everything, in the most important sense, is all right. It's all under control because of the one who sits on that throne. It's going to lead to a more beautiful, permanent, and pain-free world. The one who was, who is, and who is to come. The Alpha and Omega, who is leading us all to a beautiful, pain-free, glory-filled world.